6:32, so I apologize for me being tardy getting this started. But thank you for being here, and let's go ahead and open up in prayer. Father God, we just thank you for your creation and your world and everything that you ordain in it. And Father, we're here for a talk tonight to just hear all sides on a direction and a path that you would want us to go in. And Lord, I just ask that you bless Jeremy tonight as he comes and presents, and then allow us to leave here and go and actually do our own due diligence and decide where your Holy Spirit is leading us. And Father God, we just thank you for the time that we spend together, and we just thank you for everything that you do for us. And we ask this all in Jesus' precious name. Amen. So I'm going to have Jeremy come up. Jeremy is from the Bethel Church, and so they disaffiliated in 2020. And so they've gone through the process, and during their process, they've decided to stay as a non-denominational church or an independent church. And so he's going to come and just kind of give us a presentation and a talk on how they got to where they are and the decisions that they got to make, and then how they're growing, how they're doing, and that as a church. So I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank y'all for having me, and understand starting 2 minutes late. I do that all the time, and then I talk 5 minutes too long. So hope you had dinner. I'm only kidding, but I always promise to be brief, and then people always tell me, you always say you're going to be brief, but you never are. So, but I'll try not to talk too much tonight and give you guys a chance to ask questions as well. But as he was mentioning, Bethel, we disaffiliated. We were, from what I understand, according to the district superintendent, when we disaffiliated, we were the first church to enter into the process of disaffiliation in Western North Carolina through the paragraph 2553. And so we, in a lot of ways, had the opportunity to help pioneer that in a certain sense. Or maybe you could look at it as get into it before they really knew what they were getting into as well. But it was a learning process for two. But when Pastor Bradshaw asked me to come and speak to kind of share with you how we got to where we were, I said, well, he said, if you could plan about 45 minutes. And I went, well, I could probably wind that up in about 5, because it didn't take us long to make the decision that we made. And part of that is because of opportunity, the difference of opportunity. Because I know you guys had someone from the Global Methodist Church here last week. That wasn't a thing when we went through what we went through and when we began the discussion. And so what I thought I would do is just sort of as briefly as I can give you sort of how we got to where we got to with disaffiliation and how that spoke into the decision that we made to remain unaffiliated at this time, to be a non-denominational church. And so for us, the conversation about disaffiliating from the Methodist Church actually started at Bethel in the year 2016. There was an instance where a wedding was presided over at First United Methodist in Uptown Charlotte, where 2 men were married in front of a large number of Methodist clergy, assisted by retired bishops. And so our pastor at the time, his name was Mark Klontz, he's retired since, but was one of, I think, 18 pastors and lay leaders who filed charges against the pastor at First United Methodist for the violation of the discipline that happened there. And at the time, I think the bishop was Bishop Goodpastor, and what he did was take them into that judicial process, brought them all together and said, this is what we're going to do. There's 18 of you who've charged this. We're going to boil it down to one charge. What we're going to do is we're going to work towards through the process, which the first step would be to discuss with the pastor what they did wrong. Can we come up with a just resolution so that we don't have to go through the trial process and all that? And through that process, made the promise to the 18 complainants that he would keep them informed of the process, that they would have a seat at the table when it came to all the information and what was happening. But that is not what happened. And so in that same year, he met with that pastor. They came up with the just resolution in a secret room, sealed the results, and then he retired. And then communicated all of that on the back end. And so, and I'll preface that with understanding that there was some rumblings of the issue that has been the symptom, I would say, of a longstanding problem with the process of how things were going in the United Methodist Church. And so at that point, we began to have some conversations at Bethel about the prospect of disaffiliating from the United Methodist Church. We had a couple town hall meetings where we had some open discussions. I'll be honest with you, those didn't go very well. If I could go back and change some things, which it wasn't up to me at that point to do. I was an associate at that point. But a little bit more guided conversation would have been wise for those. But we also had the district superintendent come to answer questions at that time, which he didn't really have any. So there was a lot of that going on. And so what we did was we enacted a fact-finding committee to go, okay, what does it take? What are the provisions for exiting the denomination? And at that time, paragraph 2553 didn't exist. There were two other provisions in the Book of Discipline that's sort of in a gray area define how you could exit the denomination, but with no guarantees that you get to keep your tangible and intangible property as dictated by the trust clause. There were two churches in the state of Mississippi that managed to disaffiliate in the year 2016 through the old process. And so I reached out to both of those pastors because I was sort of put on point for that fact-finding committee and spoke to them about their process. The difference between their churches and our church was that they had a massive amount of debt. We had none at the time, still don't have any. And so using that as leverage, you had two very large churches with very large debt accounts that conference in Mississippi would have to absorb. And so it was sort of an easy way for them to get out that old way. But those pastors were very helpful in helping giving us information as to how they went through that process. And so we took an elongated opportunity to have a lot of conversations. We had a lot of meetings with our leadership. We had a lot of meetings with our congregation. As we moved closer to that point, certainly kept an eye on the committee on a way forward and all that came out of that. And then frankly, we sort of were at the point where when the special called General Conference happened in 2019, right? That's when that happened. Kept an eye on that. And I'll be honest with you that my mind was pretty much already made up as to what I thought we should do, and that was to disaffiliate. But after seeing the proceedings at that specially called General Conference, I was for sure that was probably what we needed to do because of the vileness and the vitriol that I saw coming out of that meeting. And so after that meeting, the paragraph 2553 was put into effect. And so in the beginning, I think it was in May of 2019, we sent a letter to the district superintendent at that time expressing our interest in entering into that process. He came and met with us in June and sort of outlined what they knew about it at the time, what they thought it would cost us and all of those things to disaffiliate. And so we officially entered into that process that fall. Now, COVID happened. And our vote was supposed to have been in June of 2020, but that did not happen. Our vote was put off until September when they did finally convene, and they voted us out, and we left at that point. So that was sort of our approach to disaffiliation. Now, a couple of things that we learned as a church throughout this process. One of the things that we learned about Bethel is that we didn't really have a good handle on who we were as a church. And so we identified that there were some, I wouldn't call them factions, but if you were to come up to some people and you would go, oh, hey, you guys go to Bethel Church, tell me about Bethel Church. If you went to 5 different people, you may get 5 different answers. What is it that we are about as a church? What is it that brings us together? We did a lot of conversation about what it is that may divide us from a denomination, but we didn't do a lot of conversating about what it was that made us into a church. And so one of the opportunities that we had was to settle that. And so one of the good things that came out of that for us is that we convened a team that got together, and through the course of a lot of discussion and study and a retreat weekend, we came up with what is our mission as a church? What is our vision as a church? What are our core values? What's going to filter who we are as a church? And then what's our discipleship strategy? Where do people enter and how do they work themselves through it? And then what do we expect out of disciples that come from Bethel Church or Bethel United Methodist Church, whichever at that point we were going to be, because at that point it wasn't settled. And so those were the first sort of inkling steps of us becoming who we are today. And so as we began to, as we entered into that process of disaffiliation, we began to look at a broader picture of, okay, what is it that we become? Now, like I said before, the Global Methodist Church wasn't a thing. The Wesleyan Covenant Association had launched, and Mark and myself jumped on a plane and we flew to Chicago for the launch meeting for the Wesleyan Covenant Association. We were there for that meeting, observed what happened, and then we flew home that evening. We did get some barbecue while we were in Chicago. Didn't get to go hear any blues, but we did get some barbecue. But anyway, came home and sort of kept our eye on those things. One of the pastors that I spoke to out of a church in Mississippi, I think it was called the Orchard Church. His name was Brian, I can't remember his last name off the top of my head, but was one of the founding members of the Wesleyan Covenant Association and made himself available to ask a lot of questions, and had told me that they were sort of posturing themselves and planning to become a denomination, which is now the Global Methodist Church. But there were no assurances there. And so as we worked ourselves through the process, we also took some opportunities to sit down with the DS, who was David Hockett at the time, and Bishop Leland, who was the bishop at the time that we disaffiliated. And I think our frustration with the whole thing was what really kind of turned us away from the denominational idea was the politics of it all. I think the thing that wears me out the most as a pastor is the fact that politics are in church. We were just having that conversation about something else. But so we were starting to look at, okay, what's the benefit of staying in the United Methodist Church? What's the benefit of maybe seeking out the Wesleyan Church or the Free Methodist Church? Because we were looking for other denominations that might share our theological foundations. And I'll also be honest with you that our participation in the United Methodist Church was virtually nil. We weren't heavily participating in anything that United Methodist Church did. We did the minimum things that we had to do. We had our committees. We had our charge conference every year. But otherwise than that, we didn't really do a whole lot. We helped support UMCOR, but that was about the extent of what we did. And so from a connectional standpoint, other than the Book of Discipline and the fact that we had to pay, or we were asked to pay our apportionments and things like that, our connection to the United Methodist Church wasn't busy, I would say. And Mark had been our pastor for about 13, 14 years. He ended up being at Bethel for 17 years before he retired. And so a long-standing relationship there. But he himself, I think, had sort of pulled his own roots away a little bit from all that was going on. And I think that for us, looking at that, and looking at the decline in denominationalism, I think overall through Protestantism, I think for us, led us to the point of caution. And so the questions came up, all right, what are we going to do as far as denominations concerned? Who are we going to join? And all those things. And I think part of that comes from the fact that a lot of people at Bethel, Bethel started as a family church. It's nearly a 200-year-old church. It started as a camp meeting site for the circuit riders a long, long time ago. And so there's for a long time was a family chapel, so to speak. But through the years, I've been at Bethel for a little over 10 years. A lot of that has changed as Midland has changed, as much as you guys I know have seen Mount Pleasant begin to change as well. And so. But a lot of people didn't know any different, and the idea of different scared them. Now, I'll be frankly honest with you. My background is not United Methodist. I grew up in the Southern Baptist Church, was a member at several, even when I moved here to Charlotte. My first career was not ministry. I was a certified athletic trainer for a number of years before I got into ministry, and then worked at 2 non-denominational churches before I came to Bethel. And so my experience was a little bit more broadly sparsed from coming from the Methodist Church. Coming from the Baptist Church, the church I was ordained in, and then I worked at the 2 churches that would be very reformed in their theology, I would say. We didn't make a big deal out of the secondary and tertiary issues. We agreed on the essentials of the faith. which is sort of the same thing as I came to Bethel, because I was mentored by a PCA pastor. So I'm sort of like a Baptisterian, if you wanted to put it together in a word, so to speak. And so I didn't have those same fears, and I felt like I could speak to some of those as people had those questions about what life non-denominationally could be like. Now, there's a couple things that you have to consider if you want to remain a non-denominational church. And I'll tell you that the two biggest questions that we got over and over again was who dictates your doctrine, and how do you find a preacher? And the second question is sort of a simple answer. It's just like you'd find somebody for any job. There's several job posting services out there that work just specifically for ministry. And so I think as a church, you decide what are the minimum standards that you would require for someone that you would see as a leader of your church, a shepherd of your flock, and then you go and look for that person. But the other side of it is a little bit more nuanced. Now there should be, I'll say, security in an ecumenical board who oversees your doctrine, which is, we know, the intention of the bishops in the United Methodist Church, which for us was the problem. Our problem wasn't necessarily with the issue of homosexuality. Now, we know exactly where we stand on that. We are a conservative, Orthodox believing church when it comes to that, and would very much agree with the current standards of doctrine that still exist in the United Methodist Church. Our issue was with their the accountability and the authority of it all. And that's a hot button issue, and it was for our church because there was a measure of people in our church, young families who grew up in more metropolitan areas, not in the South, who would lean a little bit more left and weren't sure where they felt about those things. And so that was a hot button thing, because as soon as you use the term homosexual, then it becomes all about that issue. But for us, as I continue to communicate that, as we as a committee continue to communicate that, we wanted to make sure people understood as best that we could communicate it to them, that this wasn't necessarily an issue of homosexuality. It was an issue, the homosexual issue is just a symptom of a greater problem that really had more or less to do with authority and how it's exercised and where does it come from. And so we felt like that there wasn't a firm standing on the basic doctrines of Scripture that they were willing to hold to, and they weren't willing to submit to the accountability that they were supposed to. And I think that's evidenced because there is still an openly gay bishop in the Western jurisdiction of the United Methodist Church who was supposedly given a 60-day, that jurisdiction was given a 60-day mandate to deal with that, but none of the bishops took up the issue, so it is still out there in the ether somewhere. And so those were sort of the problems that we had. And there wasn't another viable denomination for us to look at that we felt like was adequate for us to just immediately jump into, because of most of them, I think all of them actually, had the trust clause. And that was the biggest source of consternation with the whole thing. Now, me personally, I didn't grow up at Bethel, and so I don't have the same ties to the building and the windows and the cemetery and all that. And I understand that, and I'm not being critical of those things. But I see it as more of a foundational principled issue than I do about a property issue. And so for me, I was willing to help walk Bethel through this process, but if it came to the point where we chose property over principle, then I was willing to walk away. And I think that that's an important place to be. And it sounds like that you guys I know that you guys have already been through that because you've had your vote. But it is a painful process. And so anyway, I'm skipping around a little bit and I apologize, but getting back to that. So when we looked at that, it was just like, there wasn't really a viable option for us denominationally to pursue. And so we had to begin to ask ourselves, again, what's the benefit of in a sense, hitching our card to one of those trains? Did we feel like as a church that we were equipped with enough spiritually mature individuals who could serve as a checks and balances board to help us develop what would be our statement of faith and what would be our bylaws and our constitution for our church? And so the structure that we had under the United Methodist Church, and I know that some vary, but our executive committee was called the Board of Stewards, and there were 67 people on that committee. You had all your committee chairs plus about 35 members at large. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in a meeting with 67 people and tried to decide anything, but it's not easy. especially when you start talking about like carpet colors or wall paint and, the things that really matter. Now, I would say that most of the time, all those people didn't show up, and they would only meet twice a year to ratify the budget and for charge conference, typically. But they did show up as we were talking about disaffiliation things. And so what we decided to do was, if we were going to stay independent, we had to decide what's our polity and what's our structure. And so what we did, and you guys have a team that's similar to that, we convened a team of 12 people. It actually ended up being 13 because we added a lawyer who joined our church. But and we just called it the planning team because we couldn't think of a more snazzy name. So because they were just planning to whatever we were going to be. And so what we did was we divided that group into 3 different teams, subgroups. You had one group that was going to handle the business side of the church. What is all the things that we needed to know when it came to incorporating ourselves as an independent church. And then we also had a group that began to work on the bylaws part of it, the constitutional stuff, the polity. And then we had a group that we assigned to work on a statement of faith. And so each of those 3 groups had, from the time that we entered into the process of disaffiliation to the time that the vote happened and we had to pay our money and that we could launch as our own entity to work all of those pieces out. And I'll be honest, there wasn't a whole lot of long, sweaty nights over that for most of us. What we did was we had a breadth of people that served on that group from specific roles. We had our chief committee chairs, your finance chair, your trustees chair, your board of stewards chair, your staff parish chair, and our lay leader. And then we also had some very specific people that worked in property law, that worked in business executives, and then people who had a theological background. So that we could divide that equally and knew that we had equipped people to work on those things. And so as we began to develop those things, we still had informational meetings where we would meet with our congregation and we would present to them the work that we had been doing. Also convening that board of stewards to make sure that they knew what we were doing. They could ask questions, help direct us in that. And so where we landed was, in our polity, is that we adopted what I would call an elder-led, congregationally governed structure. Or I could say a session-led. It's sort of a hybrid type of thing. We wanted to preserve the congregational nature of the United Methodist Church structure that we had, the congregationally led piece of it, because I'll be honest, one of the biggest fears in us becoming an independent church was that we would end up in some sort of an authoritarian rule where the pastor got to dictate everything that happened at the church and nobody got a say in anything. And that was a fear that we had to deal with. And so we wanted to make sure that we went over and above in the way that we structured ourselves so that it preserved the congregational aspect of oversight in our church. And so ultimately, any big decisions that we make as a church, when it comes to property, when it comes to loans, when it comes to senior pastor hires, all of those things, when it comes to amending our bylaws, constitution, statement of faith, all of those things have to pass through congregational approval before they can happen. And so we have that group. But what we thought would be more efficient for our church, what we believed, and as we studied, as we prayed, was to narrow that executive leadership group and be very specific about how we did it. And so we have a board of 18 individuals who serve as a session. There's 9 elders and 9 deacons. And we've divided the 2 of them into different roles. Our elders are in charge of minding the membership and to be our spiritual check. They're the ones that look at what do we do, what are we doing as a church, from our programming to our teaching to our educational initiatives. Are those things passing muster when it comes to what our standards are as a church? Are we staying true to our core values? Are we staying true to our foundational mission and vision statement? And do we drift somewhere spiritually? If I say something from the pulpit that doesn't pass muster, it's that board that would come to me and go, "Hey, you need to correct this." And so they do that, and then they also serve as minding our membership. One of the things that we did was purge our membership roll. There were about 1,800 people on the membership roll at Bethel United Methodist Church. And the joke was that the FBI would have a hard time finding about 1,000 of them. That was the long-running joke. And so what we decided to do was purge that roll. But as per our disaffiliation agreement with United Methodist Church, we had to make an opportunity available for anybody who was a part of that list to remain a member of the new church, should they choose to do so. And so we had a group that got together and as best we could find the contact information that we had for all of those individuals, which we kind of had already done in having to communicate the congregational vote meeting, our church conference for that. But to reach out to them, and so we instituted a process for people to join the new church. We had a launch date. That's when it was like a mass show up. We're going to have a service, and it's going to be an en masse joining of the new church. But we wanted to define membership in a little bit of a different way. That we wanted to define membership as something that you. The easiest way for me to say that is when you go by, you want somebody to go, I'm a member of that church. I'm a part of that church, not, well, yeah, that's where I go to church. We wanted to foster a sense of ownership because that's our fourth core value is faith ownership. And so not only did we want people to own their faith, we wanted them to own their responsibility to be a part of the body of Christ. And so we changed our membership standards a little bit to expect that from people, that you couldn't just join it like you would join a social club and look for the perks of getting married and buried for free. That was the joke. So that caused some issues with some people because they thought we were kicking people out of the church. But conversations go a long way in that. And so that was one area that we decided to do something different. And the other half of our session is a board of deacons. There are 9 people that serve on that board. And for right now, how it functions at Bethel is that what we've done is divide those 9 individuals and ask them to serve in a specific area of oversight in the ministries of the church. The deacons are in charge of minding the ministries of the church. They mind the budget of the church. And then all of that information goes to the session where they discuss and vote on those things. But we have them set in specific areas. So we have a deacon that's over finance. We have a deacon that's over personnel. We have a deacon that's over property, what we would see like trustees. We have a deacon that's over outreach. We have a deacon that's over on-campus ministries. We have a deacon that's over our educational initiatives. I can't remember how many I just named, but very specific in their roles, because we felt like those are the areas of our church that we need to make sure that we develop a firm foundation if we're going to grow into the church that we want to be. The expectation is not that we were going to launch on October 18th, 2020 and be the church that we expected ourselves to be right out the gate. Because I have a famous saying that I've heard before, you don't know what you don't know. And so over the last couple of years, we've had a lot of learning curves. Nothing major. We have just this first year in January made our first amendments to our bylaws. And I only brought one copy. Y'all feel free to, I'll give it. You can, but this is a special copy because it is a copy that has what the old ones said, so in red, and then the highlighted parts and other colored parts are stuff we took out and stuff we added back in. So if you look at this, you can see kind of this is where we began, and now this is where we are. And the only things that we amended for this year were really our processes for certain things, how we choose nominees for deacons and elders. It was a cumbersome process, and so we struck some of that out. We better defined the membership part of it so that it was a bit easier to articulate and for people to understand what the expectation for them joining Bethel Church is. As a member, and so just some language, things like that. We didn't change any of our core doctrines. I will tell you that, and I was the lead person on our statement of faith, that our goal for that was to be firm in our foundation, but not try to legislate everything. We know where we stand on the essentials of the faith. We weren't setting out to try to create a position statement on every single issue that arises in the Protestant faith. What we want is to be able to promote healthy conversations over those things. And so for the firm things, we wanted to be firm, but brief in a way that people could read it, understand it, and again, articulate it, because we want people to own their faith. And so that's why. And so our document is 23 pages. And this dictates everything from our statement of faith to how to join the church, to the minimum requirement standards for the senior pastor position, how the senior pastor is chosen, how our deacons and elders, what their responsibilities are, how they're chosen, what the schedule timeline is for congregational meetings and what those are. And then there's a large portion in the back that's all indemnification stuff, which I understand is a fancy word for this, so you won't get sued if you become a part of the leadership of Bethel Church. And then the last provision is how do we amend this document. And like I said, again, we have to work through that as a session through 2 meetings of proposals, and then that is brought before the church for them to approve or disapprove. And so I have worked really hard in my role to help avoid any opportunities for people to question our goal in having a church that is congregationally ruled, but session-led. And so everything that we do runs through that group of 18 people. I do not have a vote at those session meetings. My role in those meetings is I'm invited as an advisory role, and they do ask me a lot. They do put the responsibility on me to help set the mission and vision of the church, which we already have established as a whole, but how do we program for that? So what do we do as a church to meet those in steps to get to where we want to be? They do depend on me for that, but when it comes to deciding things as a whole, I do not have a vote in any of those meetings. I don't have a vote in the finance meeting. I don't have a vote. Well, I do have a vote in the staff parish meetings, because that is the one area that I do have oversight. All of our staff answers to me, and then I answer to the session. But we do have a personnel committee that's made up of 4 or 5 people. And let me touch on that for just a second, too. And do you have any questions so far? I'm sorry. I get paid to talk, and I can just talk and talk and talk. We spent 5 years going through all this stuff, so there's a lot. So let me stop. Do you have any questions so far about anything? Okay, good. I'll keep going. That's an affirmation that you want to hear me speak. Now I forgot where I was going. Personnel committee, yes. On the idea of committees, we also purged all of our committees, which we had umpteen thousand. And we're actually trying to transition a little bit to call them a team, because do you know what a group of vultures is called? A committee. That's true. I didn't make that up. Just like a group of rhinos is called a crash. Like, there's a reason for that. So, we try to operate with that sort of mentality. Now, we're not big on titles and names of certain things like that, but we purged all our committees and go, okay, what do we need that's essential to the functions of Bethel Church? Because we don't need a committee for everything. And so we got rid of the old nominating process that used to happen. Is there would be like 2 or 3 people that would sit down in a room and go, all right, we've got 45 committees. We need to nominate chairs for all these committees. Who hadn't served in a while? And then flip through the directory and go, okay, how about this person? Yes, that person. Without any sort of evaluative, does this person even have an interest, in serving? Have they been to church in 6 months? Do they even know what's going on here, kind of a thing? And so we felt like if the deacons are in charge of minding the ministries of the church, in a sense to be the hands and feet of the ministries of Bethel Church, let them decide their committees. And so there is no, for committees, there is no maximum or minimum service time on those committees. But I will say for the session, the way it is outlined now is that once you're elected through a congregational vote to serve as an elder or a deacon, you serve in that position for 3 years. Now, when we began, we had a 1-year class, a 2-year class, and a 3-year class, but now we're on year 3. So now from everyone who has been elected since now, who began serving this year, it will be a 3-year term. Once you serve your 3-year term, you have to be absent from serving on one of those 2 boards for a minimum of 1 year before you can be eligible to be nominated again to serve. We don't allow husbands and wives to serve on those boards together, and we try to limit the number of blood relatives that serve. But in a church where you've got multi-generations, sometimes that's hard. And again, we didn't want to try to legislate every single issue that we could think of. It's like trying to legislate common sense. You can't always do that. And so those people serve a 3-year term. We do have an executive board, which we're required to as a nonprofit in the state of North Carolina. So we have a president, vice president, secretary, and a treasurer. One of the changes that we did make this year was our treasurer was also a deacon. But the treasurer that we have has been serving in his role for a long number of years, even backdating to when we were United Methodists. Very good at his job. And what we found was that part of the church in dealing with the finances and dealing with it from a project management standpoint, that role in our church works a lot like an executive pastor would work in a church that had that role. And so works a lot alongside our financial secretary, who's a full-time admin. And so we thought that position probably would be best served as an appointed position from the session that didn't have a term limit on it. And so that is one provision that we made a change in this year. There is still a deacon that works with the finance committee, but our treasurer is no longer a part of the session in that role, which also removes him from being able to vote in that. So all of that has to flow through the deacon of finance. Now, what we also did with our elders is we paired an elder with each deacon as well. And so each deacon has an elder that they can go to and speak. And so when the elders meet, they can report on what the deacons are doing. And as the deacons communicate with their elders, they also can relay that information because the deacons meet monthly, the elders meet quarterly, and the session also meets quarterly is how we work that out right now, unless there's a specially called meeting. Our elders have been meeting more frequently than that lately just because we're really trying to get a good handle on how they mind the membership of the church. And so what we did there is we took our membership roll that we have now, and we have just short of 400 members on our roll now. We took that list and divided it equally between those 9 elders, and they're responsible for the length of their term for that group of people. And so their responsibility is on a regular basis to communicate with everybody on that list, to ascertain how they're doing, if they haven't been here in a while, have they left the church, what are any prayer requests, and also for like emergency things if we have to cancel for weather or something like that. It's an easy way to communicate that out to everybody in our church. And so that's they've been working a lot on how do they best accomplish that, and so they've done a really good job about that. And so that's a lot about how we decided to structure ourselves. And again, the prospect of joining a denomination, one like the Global Methodist Church, is certainly out there, and we haven't talked about it much. But where we landed ultimately in deciding to go and do what we did and structure ourselves the way we did is that there is always the opportunity to join another denomination. And at the point where we were, again, the Global Methodist Church didn't exist. And there were a lot of questions about what was going to happen with the Wesleyan Covenant Association, what was going to happen with the potential split of the United Methodist Church, which still seems to be a bit in limbo. And so we decided that the best course for us was to just be patient, to really work on who we are as a local church, and how do we best organize ourselves to pursue the mission and the vision that we feel like God has put before us. And our mission statement is very simple: to connect the lost to life in Jesus Christ, as we pursue the mission to be a united community alive in Jesus Christ. And the way we articulate it is that as a church community, as a local church body, as Bethel Church, we want to have life and life abundantly. And we want to be united in the things that we're after because we've come out of division. And so we want to pursue that as a body, but we also want that to be a light to a community. You don't have to go very far to know that our culture is a very divisive culture. And so how do we as a church set ourselves apart differently from that? And that's also part of the reason why we chose to remain independent. Because the whole state of, and this is not an indictment on the Global Methodist Church, it would be an indictment on the United Methodist Church. But I alluded to the politics part. What we didn't want to do as best we could is not become an us versus them. We didn't want to get into that. We wanted to be able to leave on our own terms and sort of establish ourselves as our own church without saying, you're the church that hates gay people because you joined whatever this is. Because whatever you decide to hitch your car to, whichever train you decide to hitch your car to, you also go with the rhetoric that goes with that. And you have to defend yourself from that. And we've been defending ourselves against the rhetoric of being a Methodist church for quite a while. And we wanted to remove ourselves from that as best we could for a period of time at least. Not a defined period of time. And so I'll just say that, and again, that's not an indictment on the Global Methodist Church. To be honest, I don't know much about the Global Methodist Church. I know more about it this week than I did last week because I watched your session from last week just to get an idea of what they had to say. And I've perused their foundational doctrinal statement and stuff. And nothing that I've seen has given me a check about the opportunity that you have to join that denomination. And so I'm not gonna try to sway you either way. I don't feel like that's what my task is here, but to be a resource and tell you what we've done and what we how it's gone for us. And I can tell you that it has been very freeing not to have to worry about what's going on with some other board and some other place that's making decisions like that. And I'll say that part of that is some woundedness from walking away from the Methodist Church. And you as a church are probably experiencing some of the initial pieces of those wounds. As we've talked about your voting percentage, our voting percentage was 82% affirming to leave the United Methodist Church at our church conference. Now I'll say that 18%, there were a lot of people that nobody knew, but their names were on a piece of paper. And there were a lot of people so that group of 18% was a very divided group of people at that. They weren't all unified in their, some people were like, you need to go over there and vote because they're stealing your church away from you, but they ain't been to Bethel in 15 years. When I ask a member of the church who'd been there for 45 years who that person is, and they go, I've never seen that person in my life. I go, okay. And so you take that with a grain of salt. But I don't want to discount the pain because it is a painful process. Much like COVID was a painful process. And we endured that back to back at Bethel. But we're coming out of those things. And really walking into who we're getting to see the fruit of the decisions that we've made. That's not to say that it's not hard, because there is an old way of doing things. And in a roughly 200-year-old church, we have a big ship that we're turning with a small rudder right now. And one of the things that we wanted to see at Bethel was some culture change in how we did things. And so we're working on that. But we have the liberty to do that constructively. And that's been freeing, that I don't get on social media and worry about what the latest decision from the Judicial Council was, or what prospect might be out there for something different, and the anxiety of having to think through fighting a battle that I don't have to fight yet. You know what I mean? We do that. We anticipate struggles that we gird our loins for battles that haven't been defined yet, and we do that because we've been wounded, and we're fearful and we're tired. Yes, very tired. And so I understand where you're coming from, and I understand the weight of this decision. And I applaud you for taking it on the way that you're taking it on, and being a part of that. And so I can keep talking about stuff at Bethel if you want, some of the things that we've figured out to do that's been cool, but I also want to give you a chance to ask questions as well.
So we'll open up questions. Again, like last week, I'm glad you watched, so you know you're being recorded right now. Because we didn't talk about that ahead of time. I apologize.
I figured. I assume it's okay.
But again, we'll pass the mics around if you have any questions. Basically, for our recording for later on, and people being able to hear the question and then also an answer. So if you have any questions, Earl and I will be backing around and kind of let them. Sorry. Yeah, make sure, sorry, I thought that Kevin was probably saying that for me, but make sure your mic is up so you can actually hear and not down here like we like to do. So Kevin gets on us all the time about that, rightfully so. But any questions?
Yeah, just how long did it take you to develop that structure that you have now?
About a year. I'll say a year. That planning team existed for a little bit longer than that, because that planning team went through a couple of iterations. The first was just a fact-finding committee to go, okay, the basics of what we needed to know was how do we leave if we want to leave. And then once we sort of discerned that is going to be the direction that we pursue, then we started putting those pieces together. But we also didn't want to do too much too quickly. And so, like I said, we notified in May the denomination, the conference that we wanted to exit. And once we officially entered into that process, that's when that team really begun to come together and develop these pieces for us. So I would say a little over a year would be fair. I don't have an exact date and timeline. But again, for us, the disaffiliation process was the better part of a little over 4 years of conversation and discernment. And some of it's going to fall on who you choose to be on that board. Now, we had the liberty of having a property lawyer who was a member of our church volunteer his time to do all the work for us pro bono. And so when it came to having to draw up the deeds and do the title searches, and because Bethel has a lot of old property that had gone through a lot of, handwritten deed transfers from the 1800s that we found, that we had to get some things together. That certainly helped our process a little bit as well, to get us through a little more quickly and fiscally better, since the amount that we had to pay to exit the denomination was around $468,000, I believe it was, or $458,000. It was a lot. But I'll tell you what we did, and there was some pushback to this in some of the conversations. We had petitioned the conference for starting in 2016 with the judicial process with this one particular issue, and it was met with silence. And so what we chose to do was begin to withhold our apportionments from a conference level. We paid our district apportionments, and we donated a considerable amount of what we would have paid to the conference to UMCOR. But we took a significant amount. Our annual apportionments were $110,000 a year. And so the bulk of that, what we did was keep it and put it in a escrow account. And so when it came time for us to disaffiliate, we had to raise about $100,000 to equal that amount, which we were able to do in about 6 months. And so that when the time came for us to have to send that check to Huntersville, probably one of the most nervous times I've ever had in my life, I had to take that check from the church to the lawyer's office, and I was like, I got nearly $500,000 on a piece of paper right here. Like, oh my gosh, that was a bit nerve-wracking, but it's probably the only time that I'll ever have close to $500,000 in my hand. But anyway, I played the lottery on my way home.
You're now known as Bethel Church.
Yes, sir.
Is there a reason that you did not simply drop United and become Bethel Methodist Church?
Well, we did discuss that. So when we chose our name, technically, legally, our name is Bethel Church of Midland, because Bethel Church is taken in the state of North Carolina, and so we couldn't assume Bethel Church. But Bethel has always been, as they would say, Bethel Church. That's the Bethel community. I think the reason that we chose to not adopt Methodist in our incorporated name is that we wanted to try to create some separation from all of the turmoil that goes with Methodist out there. And we are, if you look through our statement of faith and our polity, you'll find that we largely kept Wesleyan flavor in that. But there's some areas that we chose to differ, like infant baptism. We don't practice infant baptism anymore. we strictly do believers baptism now. That's probably the only biggest area that we decided to make a change. But I think it was just so that we could distance ourselves from that ideology, that turmoil that has come to be synonymous with Methodism right now, which is sad, and and you can correct me if I'm wrong because you're steeped in Methodism much more than I ever was, but I don't think Methodism was ever necessarily designed to be a denomination. It was a discipleship strategy that John Wesley, and a beautiful discipleship strategy as it is, probably the best I've ever seen. And so we would have people that would go, John Wesley's rolling over in his grave, and I went, well, he died an Anglican, so maybe not, but they were surprised to hear that. But so...
Did you find during this whole process that you have lost very many members, and is your church growing? Well,
very many, perhaps is a relative term, but we had an inclination. You don't know what you don't know, but we did lose a number of families. Some of those we anticipated losing. Just from basic theological differences when it came to certain standards that we, adopted. Others a bit surprising. We had some people leave because it was a painful process, and it was painful for them to be a part of it. And to quote one of them, they just wanted to go to church someplace that they felt at peace. And I don't fault them for that because it was a painful process for a lot of people. It was a painful process for me. I had to take a lot of questions and comments and anonymous letters that I didn't anticipate having to take. But yes, we did lose a handful of members, and then again, COVID happened. And we were just having this conversation that was a process that you couldn't please either end of the spectrum on. And so we lost some families because we didn't land on one end or the other of how to deal with COVID. We tried to be smart and respectful, and that didn't please certain people, and so we did lose some people like that. So I say that to say it's a little bit hard to quantify that. But to your second question, yes, our church is beginning to grow more than it has been. We had one of the things that came out of, and it's something we didn't do before, but we created a little booklet, and we have a class each quarter. It's called Bethel Basics, and it's an opportunity for people to come. We feed them lunch. They get to read through our doctrinal statements, and then they get to read through our vision casting thing, which is this paper came out of that planning session about what is our mission, our vision, our core values. And our 4 core values are biblical truth, genuine relationships, servant hearts, and faith ownership. Those serve as the filter for everything that we do, and then outlined our discipleship strategy. And so we get to take people through that. And we had one of those last week, and I think so far from that class we've had 4 or 5 families respond with an interest in wanting to join the church. So yes, we are. I don't expect an exponential amount of growth because we are still a very rural church. And I think that there was some anticipation of more growth, but there's a lot of land that's been cleared in Midland that's still clear because of the economy and all those things. And so, which for us, I think is an opportunity for us to continue to build on areas that through this process we identified we needed. A solid, what we would call an assimilation strategy. We didn't really have one of those. What happens when people come in the door, and what do you do with them when they come in? The old way of doing it was, oh, you're related to such and such and such and such. You get to go do this with who you're related to. That was the biggest frustration for me the first 5 years I was at Bethel, was trying to figure out who was related to who, so I know who I could talk about and who I couldn't, right? Because, you don't ever want to step into that too deep. But we're not really that church anymore. And so when it comes to things like how do we assimilate people into the life of the church, what does that look like? We didn't have a well-defined, articulated discipleship strategy. And so what does that look like for people? If we expect them to own their faith, we're going to have to teach them how to do that. and I can do as best I can in a 30, 40-minute sermon, but it doesn't fall there. You got to make the church smaller, and so how do we work people through that? And so right now I see where we are as an opportunity for us to solidify those things so that as Midland and this end of Cabarrus County continues to grow, we can be prepared for those things better. And so, yeah, we have begun to see more growth, a lot of curious people in the door.
Wanda, you have a question, don't you?
I was just wondering what are the biggest struggles that you have faced, and is that in the whole process? What's been your biggest troubles to overcome?
Our biggest struggle is, I would say, from a culture standpoint, the way that things have been done in the past you do something the same way for 100 plus years, it's hard to break that cycle. And so to teach elders how to be elders and to teach deacons how to be deacons, you're trying to teach congregational members to be leaders in a way that they haven't been asked to do before. Now we do you don't just put your name on a list and go, okay, hey, you're in, but we're finding out how do we continue to mold and mind our leadership structure so that we can be as efficient and on mission as we can. And so it's working through those changes in the culture of the church and how we're structured now is I would say our biggest hardship. Does that answer your question? If I don't say something right, tell me. I'll say it differently if I can.
When you chose your name, did the administrative board or the leaders choose it, or did you let the whole congregation vote on it?
At the time that we chose it, we were still under the governance of the Board of Stewards. And so, am I cutting in and out?
Well, we're starting to lose you on the pack.
Oh.
I'm going to swap out batteries.
Oh, okay. So keep this on. Got my headset. I feel like I need braces with this thing. But anyway, so we were still under the governance of the Board of Stewards, which was our executive committee at the church. And so we were still abiding by that leadership structure. And so what we did was the team that we had formed, the planning team, those 12, 13 members, check, 1, 2, there we go.
Oh,
Seamless.
I don't want to get to know
You're
you that
fine.
well.
Well, I mean, you can take me to Whataburger later. I'm a cheap date.
Witch doctor.
I just want a milkshake. I'll be happy. So what we did was we came up with some options for names. One being Bethel Community Church, Bethel Methodist Church. Bethel Church wasn't really available, but Bethel Church of Midland was. And so we narrowed it really to those three options, that group, and then we took it before that Board of Stewards and said, these are the options. And so that board chose what our name would be. And that's how that came to be.
Got a question back here.
Sure.
Has your elders committee or session discussed how they're going to go about choosing a new pastor? You're a relatively young man, so many years ahead of you, but
Maybe.
when it's time for you to move on,
Yeah.
how is your church going to choose? Because you won't have necessarily seminaries that are producing, you're an independent church. Are you going to poach from another denomination or try and grow from within?
So there's a provision in our bylaws that dictates the formation of a search committee, and very much like you would if you were in a more autonomous denomination like the Baptist Church, that search committee would enact a process in searching, and so we did that. I wasn't automatically just slid into the role of senior pastor. When we became an independent church, Mark, our senior pastor that was with us in the United Methodist Church, knew that he was going to retire, and his commitment was to stay with us until we disaffiliated and we got sort of moving as an independent church. And so he was he retired from the United Methodist Church in the same year that we disaffiliated. Now, he retired in June. We weren't voted out until September, but the DS was very gracious and allowed him to stay, to allow Bethel to be without an appointment, so to speak, and we hired Mark as a contract employee to oversee us as our senior pastor until we got to that next step. And so in February of 2021, he officially retired, February 1st. At that point, through the session, formed and appointed a search committee. They asked me to become an interim lead pastor at that point, to which I agreed to. And then they began the process that is outlined in our bylaws to search for a senior pastor. Now, I didn't immediately put my name in the hat for that position. As a matter of fact, I was a little bit hesitant to do so, really for reasons, not that I didn't feel like I was prepared or ready, but because my concern is that my face as the leader of the disaffiliation group, so to speak, I felt like might represent some division amongst the people, and I didn't want to be a part of continuing to foster that. And so it was with a lot of prayer, a lot of conversation, with a broad scope of people at Bethel. It wasn't until after that I decided to put my name in the hat. And so what they did was there's minimum requirements in our bylaws that dictates the role of the senior pastor at Bethel and the formation of this search committee. There's no time limit set to it or what have you. And so what they did was they came up with the job description. And part of what we're learning to do as a church is we didn't legislate everything, and so there's certain policies that go with the legislative items that we make note of. And so as the search committee comes together to function, how do they function? And so we can write policies for that group that sort of governs that process. And that's one of the big things that we learned through that was. And so they came up with the job description. There's several church-specific job search websites out there. And so they posted that position there. And I think so I became the interim senior pastor in February of 2021. In the course of about 8 weeks, we got 70 plus resumes for the position of senior pastor. Some were Jim, Joe, Bob, just graduated from high school, really feel like I'm led to go lead a church type of things, to some United Methodist pastors who were looking to get away from the United Methodist Church. And I stayed out of that process wholly and completely. I didn't go to any of those meetings from the front end, but especially after I submitted my name for that. And so throughout that process of conversation, prayer, discernment, they narrowed the pool down to 5 people and reached out to those folks. Of course, I had the advantage of a working interview, so to speak, and they knew me. But as it boiled down, what they did was take what they had and compared it to kind of what I was doing and go, well, he's kind of doing what all we need to do right now. And so in May, they asked me if I would just remain on and become the senior pastor. And so there's a process for removing me if I need to be removed, of what that looks like if I go off the rails. There's a process for that. There is a process for establishing an interim at the same time. And so it would be just a regular, I won't say regular, but it would be a search process, much in the same way that you might go to find a youth pastor or something like that. Because there are even search organizations that you can partner with that will help you do that as well. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Last week, one of the questions that was brought up, and I think it's only fair to ask you as well, is there a restriction for women serving in your pulpit?
There is not. Now, we have women that serve as deacons and elders, but it's not specified in those 2 position roles. It doesn't restrict it, but specifically in the senior pastor job description, it says there's language that says a male or female. Now, I will tell you that Bethel, in its complete history, has never had a female pastor. We have a hall of preachers that goes on the sides of our sanctuary. It's like 2 lines of like a Hall of Fame kind of thing, and there's no, it's all men. And I think a lot of people at Bethel would feel uncomfortable with that. And to be honest with you, it's something that I had to reconcile, coming from a Southern Baptist background, being mentored by a Presbyterian Church in America pastor, and then working in churches that were more reformed in theology that didn't allow women to assume the title of pastor. So it wasn't, for me, it wasn't something that I had to deal with on a real world basis because I had never been exposed to it. Now, theologically, you talk about egalitarianism and complementarianism in seminary, but we don't talk a lot about that. And so there's some areas that I had to reconcile when I came to Bethel. Now, the other full-time, we have 3 full-time pastoral positions, but the only one that has the title, that carries the title of pastor, is my position. We have a director of Christian education who is a female. Her name is Allison. And she's very wonderful at her job and is a very gifted teacher. And so as it stands right now, when I'm not in the pulpit, most of the time she fills it for me, and does a very capable job of doing so. And that was one of the areas that was, I'll say, a stickler with our membership, with our congregation as we were developing ourselves in a new church, a carryover from that Methodist practice of Wesleyan theology that we do affirm women in leadership. Now, I will also say that we, as an independent church, you have the opportunity as an autonomous church to develop what your ordination standards would be should you choose to have an ordination board, committee, whatever you would like to call them. In the state of North Carolina, there is no legal precedent for you necessarily to do, like, that governs how that happens. And so just like in the Southern Baptist Church, and that's the one I'm familiar with, more so than anything else, but also the church that I was at before I came to Bethel, it's a church called Life Fellowship in Davidson, North Carolina, and it was a church plant out of Fellowship Bible Church in Little Rock, Arkansas. They convene their own ordination committee within the church. It's made up of deacons and elders and retired pastors who are part of the congregation, which is the same in the church that ordained me. I wasn't ordained through the Southern Baptist Convention. I was ordained through the autonomous board from a local church at a Southern Baptist church. And so you can do that. We have not written that policy at Bethel. We don't have a provision for an ordination board, but we can do that. And so that's a long answer to a short question, but there is no restriction on women serving in leadership at Bethel.
All churches have a budget.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure when you guys were in your planning stages, you took into account, how much income you had flowing in from your members. So how did the loss of membership, because like you said, you can't determine, don't know how many are going to leave. How do you determine if you're going to be able to financially support yourself?
So when we left the Methodist Church, we had every year that we were still Methodist from 2016 till when we disaffiliated, we kept the apportionments as a part of our budget. We just withheld that, and so we continue that. But when we became an independent church, we removed that piece of it, which was a considerable amount, and so we had to look at how we did the budgeting. Now I'll tell you that throughout any of that time, we never fell short of our budget. As a matter of fact, every year we've had a surplus. And I'll tell you that every penny of that $460,000+ that we gave to the United Methodist Church, we have gotten back in some way, shape, or form, in a surplus from what our normal giving would be. And so we just looked at what the expenditures of the programming that we had, what did we need to make that function. Now, I make less than the other senior pastors, so we got a break on some of the salary pieces of it, which is fine. I mean, he was in ministry for almost 40 years. Like, I get that. But anyway, and so we were able to adjust some things like that. And so it's that's part of the job of our treasurer, is to mind those things. And he meets with the elder and the deacon of finance, and then they report to the finance committee, which then makes recommendations to the session as to how we budget every year, and then that is approved by the congregation. And so we look at it from we over budget at Bethel. We smart or not, we tend to have a surplus at the end of the year of money that we haven't spent. But that we've budgeted for, and we've met budget through the whole thing. We met budget all the way through COVID. And so the people that left and I don't hear me say this, and don't hear me say this flippantly or negatively, but the people that left didn't impact the finances of the church, nor did they really impact the ministries of the church. We were sad to see them go, but we didn't. From a ministry standpoint and a budgeting standpoint, we didn't lose anything. But you hate to see anybody go.
Jeremy, I'll say, if anybody wants to read your bylaws, they are online.
The
Right.
old copy
The
is
old
still.
copy,
We
okay.
haven't put the new. Our secretary is still, because we had to change the way it's all enumerated. So you got to go through the whole thing. She hadn't.
But yes, but if somebody wants to get a feel
But you can.
for-
The first iteration is on our website, bethelmidland.com. And make sure you say it Midland when you type it, because it's Midland, not Midland. They'll correct you. That was the first thing we covered in my interview. This is Midland, not Midland. Midland's in Texas. That was what it meant.
And then, for tax exempt purposes, did y'all become a 501c3 or a?
No, we have not. And I think the provision suggestion is the same for the Global Methodist Church. I think it's IRS code 508 or C or
508c1a.
Yeah, that. So and I know you guys are already incorporated, if you incorporate with the federal government as a church, then you are granted, you can consider it grandfathered into the same tax exempt status as if you were a 501c3 organization. So we have not pursued 501c3 status yet. It is something that is on the table that we have begun to discuss, but it is not something that we have pursued. And we are incorporated, I'm sure, just like you guys, as a nonprofit in the state of North Carolina. So it operates that same way.
So we're talking briefly about ordination, and that the church does not have a provision for ordination at this point in time.
Correct.
Where does ordination come into play for those involved, for you, for the other
So if we
pastors?
were going to hire somebody that we expected to be an ordained minister. Now, how Bethel was structured before I came to work there was we had one appointed position, and that was the senior pastor. The director of children and youth ministries, which is the job that I came into when I first started working at Bethel in 2013, was what's called a lay leader position. And so I wasn't part of, and never was a part of, the appointed process as a deacon or elder or a licensed local pastor in the United Methodist Church, and neither was our associate minister position at the time. When I came to work at Bethel, we had a senior pastor, an associate pastor, a minister, however you want to title that, and director of children and youth. We've changed those titles a little bit here and there, but if we were going to hire someone that we expected to be an ordained minister, they would have to prove that they've been ordained through a mainline, for lack of a better word, accredited denomination. Not because you can go online and get ordained for like $50 and marry your buddy if you want, but we're not willing to accept that. The expectation for my role is seminary educated, experienced, and ordained. Now we're in the process of interviewing for a student ministry position. Our expectation is that person doesn't have to be ordained to do that role. And if we ever feel like we get to the point, and we're not ready for this yet at Bethel, to adopt our own ordination committee, one of the churches in Mississippi had done that, because at the time that they disaffiliated, they had to surrender their credentials. There was no Global Methodist Church to move to. So to become an independent church, you had to deal with how does your staff, how are they accountable to ordination standards? And so they did create an ordination standard and shared that with us. So we have some information that we could get to once we're ready for that. But because I came to the table already having been ordained in a mainline recognized Protestant denomination, that wasn't an area we had to be concerned about.
I'm starting to get the sense that some are getting tired.
Sorry, I didn't mean to put you to sleep.
They're used to a 20-minute sermon, not a 40-minute sermon. That's
Yeah.
I've conditioned them that way, unfortunately. But are there any burning questions right now for you guys? Jeremy, we want to just say thank
I
you.
think you got one back there.
Keep it brief.
That's a relative term.
Do y'all have a parsonage or feel the need for a parsonage?
We do not have a parsonage. We did have a parsonage, but no one lived in it because it was full of mold and lead paint. And so we made the decision years ago to tear that down when we were still a Methodist church. And now that's actually the site where we met outside during COVID. It became a little grassy area and was convenient for that. So I think maybe one of the questions that we talked about too was how do we handle insurance, retirement, those kind of things. I will say that Bethel, as it practiced prior to our disaffiliation, because the associate positions were not appointed positions, they didn't have to carry a group insurance responsibility or retirement responsibility. And now as an independent church, we don't have enough staff to really have an affordable group insurance option. And so how that works at Bethel is part of my salary package is designated for me to go and find my own insurance, and also a certain amount that they match for me to put into a retirement fund of my own choosing. But those are my responsibility to find on my own. And that's been the way that it's worked for every other position apart from the appointed senior pastor that we had as a United Methodist Church.
Thank you, Leonard. And if you don't know, we have a great parsonage. I mean, it's one of the nicest I've ever been in. And in fact, when people come to visit us, we go, it's not our house. It's not our house. Because you guys this is the nicest parsonage I've been in all of Western North Carolina. So I just want to say thank you. So great question, but it really is a beautiful house, 3,400 square feet, built in '98. It's great, all except for some of the neighbors. Not you, Spring. It's Ron throwing fair gravy on me. That's the only difference.
And I will say too, I don't know how they do that here, but what we found at Bethel was that we didn't have the senior pastor's salary structure, and it may be different because of how the United Methodist Church is structured, but at least I know for sure in North Carolina, as the senior pastor, they have to treat me as a senior pastor from a tax standpoint. So I'm responsible for both sides of all of my Social Security and things. And so we had to change in how my salary is divvied out when it comes to a housing allowance. Mark didn't really have a housing allowance. And I think that we learned that was a mistake that we corrected. And so the IRS has a process that you have to go through to determine what that housing allowance should be.
Thank you.
Which makes taxes really fun.
And I don't want to, I do want to be mindful of people's time, but are there any other pressing questions right now? Steve, will you pray for Jeremy and then just also pray for the whole process for us, if you would, brother?
And if you have any other questions, once we dismiss, Whataburger's open till 9? So you got a few minutes. But thank y'all for having me. I'll say that.
Well, and I do, before, thank you for coming and very informative. I know for myself, there was a lot of questions on being independent or being non-denominational because I've only ever known a denomination. Yeah. So there's a lot of good things. No matter what direction we end up going, there was a lot of good things that you guys went through that we need to take into account.
And I'll say too, if there's anything that we have, anything that we've done, you guys are welcome to. I'll give you whatever you want. Is that we have. It's people were kind enough to do that for us. So
thank you. Let's go ahead and pray. Father God, we just thank you for Bethel Church, and we thank you for Jeremy and his ministry and his leadership in that church and all the leaders in that church. And Lord, just have your hand upon them and allow them to grow and prosper in the way that you would want them to grow and prosper. And Lord, just be with them and all their decisions and just send the Holy Spirit on them in order to discern your vision for that church. And Lord, as we move forward as a church here, do the same for us. Allow leadership to discern and be there, but also just be with everybody in the decision process, that we answer questions, that we just have all of the information that we need to make the best possible decision that is for your glory and for the glory of this facility and our church and this community. Lord, as we leave today, have a safe travels home and allow us to see your hands and feet at work, and even if it's our own hands and feet at work this week in the ministry that you would want us to have. And we ask this all in Jesus' precious name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you again.